The Russian Empire stretched over vast territory which spanned from Poland all the way to the Pacific. Living within its domain were many millions of peoples drawn from all manner of cultures. However, it is debatable as to when the empire actually began, with some claiming 1450, while others insist that the empire was officially started with the rule of Peter the Great in 1721. However, to really understand it, we need to go way back to the 9th century. The land that came to be known as Russia was inhabited by the Rus people in the 860s. Then, about a century later, these people established ties with the Byzantine Empire, with Christianity becoming the official religion in 988. During the 13th century, the Rus people were invaded by the Mongols. The devastation caused took more than a century to recover from. The re-emerged Rus population, however, were to forge themselves into a unique empire. The Russian Empire's rise coincided with the demise of the Byzantine Empire. In 1453, the Byzantines were defeated by the Turkish Ottomans. By that time, the great city of the Rus, Moscow, was being proclaimed as the Third Rome, with Russia now being the main Orthodox Christian power. The Russian people considered themselves to be the direct inheritors of the Roman Empire. The first Russian monarch to take on the mantle of successor of the Byzantine Empire was Ivan III, who assumed the title of Tsar. He also married a Byzantine princess, Sophia Palaeologina, who was the niece of the last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI. Ivan built up the Russian military, a task which was carried on by his son and successor, Vasily III. The strong Russian army that resulted in the early 1500s allowed for expansion in all directions. Municipalities were established from this new territory, along with defensive fortifications to protect them. The biggest threat to Russia at that time was Crimea, whose warlords teamed up with the Khanate Mongol inheritors in 1521 to launch a series of offensive strikes into Russian territory. This combined force almost marched their way to Moscow, forcing Vasily to temporarily evacuate. The Russian army eventually managed to push back the threat. Tsar Vasily III now faced a crisis of succession. After 20 years of marriage, his wife had been unable to produce an heir. As a result, he divorced her and married the much younger Elena Glinskaya, who did produce a son. He would grow up to become Ivan IV, who history remembers as Ivan the Terrible. Ivan was born around 1530. 3 years later, his father died, making him the Tsar under guardianship. Empress Elena, along with court officials, became Ivan's stewards until he came of age. However, Elena died when Ivan was only 7. It is believed the empress was murdered, leaving the young Tsar at the mercy of court officials. The child was not treated well, later claiming that he had been locked in a room and only let out to attend special ceremonies at court. On January 16, 1547, on reaching his 16th birthday, Ivan was finally handed the crown. A year later, he married Anastasia Romanova, thus establishing the Romanov dynasty. That June, a great fire ripped through Moscow, leaving tens of thousands of people homeless. People blamed the young Tsar, with riots breaking out across the city. Ivan was ushered to the safety of a remote estate, but rioters soon found out where he was and marched on the residence. Ivan came out to try and calm the crowd, but this only made things worse. Just when it seemed that he was about to be torn to pieces by the crowds, an aged holy man by the name of Sylvester grabbed up the young Tsar and then forcefully reminded the rioters that even if Ivan was somehow responsible for the fire, the greatest Christian virtue was forgiveness. Ivan then prostrated himself before the crowd. This was enough to turn the tide, and the people went away peacefully. This episode convinced Ivan that he needed to increase his power over the people. He strengthened the military and centralized bureaucracy. In 1552, he sent the resurgent army of 150,000 troops against one of the last strongholds of the Mongol Golden Horde, Kazan. The Russians referred to these people as Tartars and had been intent on subjugating them for more than a century. Tartar raids had been a thorn in the side of the Russians, and now they were determined to put an end to the menace. After a prolonged siege, the main Kazan fortress fell on October 2nd, 1552. 2 years later, an even greater offensive action was launched against the Tartars further south in the region of Astrakhan, situated on the passage leading to the Caspian Sea. The success of this invasion gave Russia complete control of both the Volga and Caspian Seas. This provided the impetus for the building of the Russian Navy. Ivan next turned his expansionist attention to the west. The result was the Livonian War, against an amalgamation of territories in Eastern Europe in what is now Latvia and Estonia. Ivan sent his army into the area in 1558. The initial Russian offensive met with success. However, it was stopped in 1560 by a resurgent Livonian force at the city of Revel. This was destined to drag on for 25 years, with Denmark, Sweden, and Poland also being dragged into the fray. 1560 also saw the death of Ivan's wife, the Empress Anastasia. This tragedy marked a distinct change in the Tsar's personality. He became sour, aloof, and angry, giving rise to the descriptor Grozny, meaning terrible. In 1571, bloody revolts broke out in the recently conquered Tatar regions. This meant that the Russian army now had to fight on two fronts. By 1578, things were not going well against the Livonians, and Ivan was forced to come to the negotiating table. These talks soon fell through, and the fighting resumed. When the Poles, Germans, and Transylvanians joined forces with the Livonians, a desperate Ivan sent envoys to Rome calling for aid. Ivan made an amazing proposal. If the Pope would call off the attackers, the whole of Russia would convert to Catholicism. This card was never played, as renewed peace talks led to a treaty of peace in 1583. Ivan died the following year. He was succeeded by his son, Fyodor I. This was Ivan's second son, with the oldest, Ivan Ivanovich, having been beaten to death by his father years earlier. In what was one of the most shocking scandals in royal history, the Tsar had apparently been offended that Ivan's wife was wearing immodest clothing. His rage caused him to beat his pregnant daughter-in-law violently, causing a miscarriage. When the son confronted his father, he was beaten even more violently, this time to the point of death. The young and inexperienced Fyodor was merely a puppet ruler, with the real power being exerted by Boris Godunov, the chief of police. At this point, the empire was in decline. When Fyodor died in 1598 without an heir, Godunov managed to get himself crowned as Tsar, being the first regent outside of the dynastic line. This marked the beginning of a period known as the Time of Troubles. The Russian economy was in turmoil, and millions of people struggled to survive. Peasants fled their landlords' estates. Godunov attempted a number of reforms, but none was successful. A famine in 1601 proved devastating. In 1604, a party of rebels attempted to push Godunov out of power. However, he died before they could accomplish the task. Having no heir, the death of the Tsar again led to a crisis of succession. Rebel leader Grigory Otrepev was able to step into the breach by claiming to be Ivan the Terrible's long-lost son, Dmitry. The ruse worked, but his reign was a short one, ending with his assassination in May 1606. Grigory was succeeded by a wealthy noble named Vasily Shuisky. Soon thereafter, a major rebellion broke out. The new Tsar had to call on the Poles to help put it down. However, Vasily's rule was very unpopular, and he was forced to resign in 1610. At this point, Russia was facing its greatest crisis to date. The noble boyar class wanted to put in place a Polish prince by the way of Vladislav, but this enraged the populace. An armed mob seized Moscow in 1612 and forced the General Assembly to elect Mikhail Romanov, a descendant of Anastasia, as the next Tsar. This instituted the Russian dynasty. Acting in concert with his father, Fyodor, who was made Patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, Mikhail managed to stabilize the empire. In 1618, he signed an armistice with Poland that ensured peace for the next 14 years, but that also cost some important Russian territory, including the key outpost of Smolensk. In 1634, the Russian army tried to recapture Smolensk, but this was unsuccessful. In a renewed agreement, the Russians were made to give up on any future claims to Smolensk, as well as paying reparations of 20,000 rubles. Mikhail died in 1645 and was succeeded by his son, Alexei Mikhailovich. The 16-year-old had a key advisor, Boris Morozov, whose harsh measures infuriated the masses, leading to his axing by the young Tsar. He then had a special council to fix the major social issues facing the population. This only resulted in an increase in the power of landlords over the serfs who labored for them. In 1676, Alexei died, with the throne going to his 15-year-old son, Fyodor III. Partially paralyzed, the new Tsar did his best to both stabilize the empire and father an heir. He went through 2 wives, but no child was produced. When he died in 1682, the throne was shared by his brother Ivan and half-brother Peter as co-regents. Then, in 1696, the sickly Ivan died, leaving Peter as the sole regent.